A poor waitress gives her only jacket to a freezing biker on a snowy night, thinking she'll never see him again. But the next day, her small town wakes up to the roar of 1,000 motorcycles circling the diner where she works, each one there for her. At first, it seems like a miracle, until she learns the truth about who that biker really was, and why the crowd outside isn't just there to thank her. What begins as one small act of kindness spirals into a story of redemption, faith, and a town forced to choose between greed and grace. But when tragedy strikes and everything she built burns to the ground, can one act of kindness really save 1,000 hearts? Or will it break hers first? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The fluorescent lights of the highway diner hummed softly overhead as Grace Malone refilled another coffee cup, her movements careful and practiced from years of late-night shifts. The ceramic mug clinked gently against its saucer as she set it down in front of a tired-looking trucker who barely looked up from his phone. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, adjusting her name tag that had gone slightly crooked. The trucker shook his head, his eyes still fixed on his screen. Grace nodded and moved back behind the counter, her feet aching in her worn shoes. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 at night, and the snow outside fell in thick, heavy flakes that made the world beyond the diner's windows look like a snow globe someone had just shaken. Martha, the other waitress working the late shift, came up beside her. "My feet are killing me," she complained, leaning against the counter. "At least it's quiet tonight. This weather's keeping folks home." Grace smiled softly, remembering how Tommy used to say, weather like this separated the sensible from the stubborn. The thought of her late husband sent a familiar ache through her chest, but she pushed it aside. There was work to be done. The bell above the door chimed as a gust of cold air swept in, carrying with it a few snowflakes that melted instantly on the worn linoleum floor. Grace looked up, expecting another regular customer, but no one came in. Instead, through the frosted windows, she could make out a figure by the gas pumps. Moving closer to the window, Grace wiped away some of the condensation with her sleeve. In the harsh glare of the overhead lights, she saw him clearly now, a large man in a leather vest, his muscled arms covered in tattoos, kicking at a motorcycle that refused to start. His breath came out in visible puffs in the freezing air, and even from inside, Grace could see him shivering. "Would you look at that?" Martha whispered, appearing at Grace's shoulder. "One of those bikers. Nothing but trouble, if you ask me. Better hope he doesn't come in here." Grace barely heard her. She was too busy noticing how the man had nothing but a thin denim vest over what looked like a t-shirt. The temperature had dropped well below freezing hours ago, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. "Poor soul must be freezing," Grace murmured, more to herself than to Martha. "Poor soul," Martha scoffed. "Grace, honey, look at him. Those tattoos? That bike? He's probably run with every rough crowd from here to Texas. Best to mind our own business." But Grace was already reaching for her jacket, the worn brown one she'd had for years, with the fleece lining that was still warm despite its age. Tommy had given it to her for their last Christmas together, and she'd kept it carefully maintained, even as other things had worn out or been replaced. "Grace Malone, don't you dare!" Martha hissed, grabbing her arm. "You don't know what kind of person he is. He could be dangerous." Grace gently pulled free from Martha's grip. "I know exactly what kind of person he is right now, Martha. He's cold." The bell chimed again as Grace pushed open the door, the bitter wind immediately biting at her face. The snow crunched under her shoes as she made her way carefully across the parking lot, holding her jacket close to her chest. The biker had his back to her now, still struggling with his motorcycle. As she got closer, she could hear him muttering under his breath, his hands shaking as he tried to work the key in the ignition. He must have heard her approaching, because he suddenly straightened up, turning to face her with a guarded expression that made Grace pause mid-step. Up close, his tattoos told stories, military insignias mixed with personal artwork, some faded with age. His face was weathered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both harsh sun and harder times. But what caught Grace's attention most was how badly he was shivering, though he was trying to hide it. "Ma'am," he said gruffly, his voice rough but not unkind. "Diner still open?" Grace nodded, clutching her jacket a little tighter. "Yes, sir. We're open till midnight." She hesitated for just a moment before adding, "But before you come in, I thought you might need this more than I do right now." She held out her jacket, and for a long moment, the biker just stared at it, then at her, as if trying to understand what was happening. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion, and then to something else. Something that reminded Grace of how Tommy used to look when something touched his heart. But he didn't want to show it. "I can't take your jacket, ma'am," he said finally, his voice softer now. "Please," Grace insisted, stepping forward and holding it out again. "My car's right there, and I'm heading home soon anyway. You need it more than I do right now." The biker looked at her for another long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to find the catch, the hidden agenda. But Grace just stood there, snow gathering in her graying hair, holding out her jacket with a gentle determination that came from years, of helping others even when her own cupboards were bare. Finally, with hands that were red from the cold, he reached out and took the jacket. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He cleared his throat. "I don't know what to say." Grace smiled, feeling snowflakes melt on her cheeks. "You don't have to say anything, but I've got hot coffee inside if you'd like to warm up properly." The biker carefully put on the jacket, which fit him snugly but better than no jacket at all. He zipped it up, and Grace saw the immediate relief in his posture as the warmth began to seep in. "I'm Grace," she said, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "Hawk," he replied, nodding slightly. "They call me Hawk." He glanced at his motorcycle, then back at Grace. "Coffee sounds good right about now." Together, they walked back toward the diner, the snow falling steadily around them. Martha's face was pressed against the window, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. As they reached the door, Hawk held it open for Grace, the bell chiming above them as they entered the warm diner. "Let me get you that coffee," Grace said, hurrying behind the counter, while Hawk chose a booth near the window where he could keep an eye on his bike. Martha hovered nervously nearby, but Grace gave her a reassuring smile as she filled a large mug with steaming coffee. The ceramic mug clinked against the table as Grace set it down in front of Hawk. Steam rose from the dark liquid, curling in the air between them. She could see him working up to say something, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, her jacket still zipped up to his chin. "I've been riding for 30 years, he said finally, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "Never had anyone just give me their jacket before. Most folks see someone like me and cross to the other side of the street." Grace slid into the booth across from him, her own hands folded on the table. "My Tommy, my late husband, he used to say you can't judge a book by its cover, but you can always judge a person by how they treat others who can't do anything for them." She smiled softly, remembering. "He was a mechanic. Taught me that everybody deserves a little kindness, especially when they're having a rough time of it." Hawk took a long sip of his coffee, and Grace could see some of the tension leaving his shoulders as the warmth spread through him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating his motorcycle in a thin white blanket. But in here, there was warmth and the smell of coffee and something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. The words Tommy had said so often echoed in Grace's mind. "Always keep the coffee hot and the door open, Gracie. You never know when someone might need a little warmth in their world." Looking at the biker sitting across from her, warming his hands on a cup of coffee and wearing her jacket, Grace knew Tommy would have understood exactly why she'd done what she did. Martha was still watching from behind the counter, but her expression had softened somewhat as she watched Hawk carefully handle the coffee mug with respect, his posture proper despite his rough appearance. It was amazing how a simple act of kindness could change the atmosphere in a room, how it could make people see past their first impressions to the humanity underneath. The snow fell outside, covering Maple Creek in a blanket of white, but inside the highway diner, something warm and unexpected was beginning to bloom. A reminder that even in the coldest moments, kindness could thaw the most frozen of hearts. Snow whipped mercilessly across the parking lot as Grace made her way toward the stranded biker. Her uniform dress offered little protection against the bitter cold, but she pressed forward, watching how his hands trembled as he worked on his motorcycle. Up close, she could see the intricate tattoos that covered his arms, eagles and flags, military insignias that spoke of a different life than his current appearance suggested. "You should come inside," Grace called out over the howling wind. "It's warm, and I've got fresh coffee." The man straightened up, his tall frame towering over her petite figure. His face was weathered, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years, and his lips had taken on an alarming bluish tint from the cold. "Name's Hawk," he said curtly, his voice gruff but not unkind. "And I appreciate it, ma'am, but I don't take charity." He turned back to his bike, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the wrench. Grace watched him struggle for a moment, memories of Tommy flooding back, how he'd always tried to help stranded motorists, no matter the hour or weather. Without hesitation, she unzipped her coat, the warm one Tommy had given her 2 Christmases before he passed. "You'll freeze to death before pride warms you," she said softly, holding out the jacket. The wind caught her words, carrying them away, but Hawk heard them nonetheless. He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. It was a strange moment. Something passed between them that Grace couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. In his eyes, she saw something familiar, the same kind of pain she'd carried since Tommy's passing, though his seemed fresher, rawer somehow. Hawk's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Grace thought he would refuse again. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, defeat or acceptance, maybe both, crossing his features. His calloused hands reached out, accepting the coat with a gentleness that surprised her. "Thank you," he muttered, the words barely audible above the wind. He slipped the coat on, and Grace noticed how it stretched across his broad shoulders. It would be warm, though. Tommy had always said it was the warmest coat he'd ever owned. Hawk turned back to his motorcycle, gave it one more kick, and this time the engine sputtered to life, belching exhaust into the snowy night. The rumble of the engine seemed to echo off the empty buildings surrounding the diner, a lonely sound in the winter night. Without another word, Hawk swung his leg over the bike. He gave Grace one last look, something unspoken in his eyes, before he gunned the engine and rode away into the swirling snow. Grace watched until his taillights disappeared into the white darkness of the highway, becoming nothing more than red smudges, and then nothing at all. Standing there in the parking lot, snow collecting in her hair and on her shoulders, Grace shivered. The cold bit through her thin uniform now, making her teeth chatter. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling foolish. What had she been thinking, giving her coat to a complete stranger? Martha would surely scold her for such recklessness. Yet beneath the cold and uncertainty, there was a strange peace settling in her heart. It felt right somehow, like something Tommy would have done, like something she needed to do. The bell above the diner door jingled as Grace hurried back inside. Martha was waiting, hands on her hips, ready with a lecture about taking unnecessary risks. But before she could start, a truck driver at the counter spoke up. "Ma'am," he said, holding up his phone, "hope you don't mind, but I took a picture of what you did out there. People should see there's still good folks in the world." Grace's cheeks flushed. "Oh, that's not necessary," she started, but the truck driver was already showing her the photo on his phone screen. It was blurry, taken through the window and the falling snow, but there it was. Grace, in her waitress apron, handing her coat to the imposing figure of Hawk. The image captured the moment perfectly. The swirling snow, the neon lights of the diner casting a soft glow, the stark contrast between the small woman and the tall biker. "Already posted it online," the truck driver said proudly. "People need to see this kind of thing. Reminds them there's still kindness out there." Grace felt her face grow warmer, uncomfortable with the attention. She hurried back behind the counter, focusing on refilling coffee cups and wiping down already clean surfaces. But she couldn't help wondering about Hawk, hoping he was warm enough, praying he'd make it safely to wherever he was headed. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of coffee refills and quiet conversations with the few remaining customers. The snow continued to fall outside, coating everything in a thick white blanket that muffled the world. By the time 2 o'clock in the morning rolled around, Grace's feet ached and her arms were heavy with fatigue. She bundled up as best she could in her spare sweater from her locker, though it was a poor substitute for her lost coat. The walk home was brutal. 3 blocks that felt like 3 miles in the bitter cold and driving snow. Her house was dark when she arrived, and she hurried inside, grateful for the minimal warmth her ancient heater provided. As she prepared for bed, Grace's thoughts kept returning to Hawk and her coat. She said a quick prayer for his safety, wherever he was, before climbing under her pile of blankets. Despite the cold seeping through her poorly insulated walls, that sense of peace from earlier remained, warming her from the inside out. Her last thoughts before drifting off to sleep were of Tommy, and how he would have approved of her actions tonight. "Always keep the coffee hot and the door open," he used to say. Tonight, she'd done one better. She'd given away her coat to a stranger in need. Somehow she knew Tommy would have understood completely. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick clouds still hanging over Maple Creek. Grace's ancient alarm clock buzzed at 6 o'clock, and she reached out from under her pile of blankets to silence it. Her muscles protested as she sat up, still aching from yesterday's long shift and the cold walk home. The quiet of her morning routine was suddenly broken by the sharp ring of her phone. Grace frowned. Nobody ever called this early. The screen showed Lydia's name, and before Grace could even say hello, her friend's excited voice burst through the speaker. "Grace, have you seen it? The photo's everywhere. You've got to look online right now." "Lydia, slow down," Grace said, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "What photo?" "The one from last night. That truck driver posted it, and it's gone viral. Everyone's sharing it." As if on cue, the phone beeped with another incoming call. And another. And another. Grace's stomach tightened with anxiety as she realized what was happening. That blurry photo of her giving away her coat was spreading across the internet. By the time Grace arrived at the diner for her morning shift, her phone had nearly 50 missed calls. She'd turned it to silent, unable to handle the constant ringing. Martha greeted her with wide eyes and a stack of message slips. 3 news stations called, Martha said, shuffling through the papers. "And some magazine wants to do a feature on you. They're calling you the Angel Waitress of Maple Creek." Grace felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. "Oh no," she murmured, tying her apron with trembling fingers. I never meant for any of this to happen." The bell above the door chimed, and Lydia burst in, her curly hair wild from the wind, clutching her phone like it was made of gold. "Grace Malone!" she exclaimed, rushing to the counter. "You're famous!" "Please, Lydia," Grace pleaded, but her friend was already shoving the phone in her face. The screen showed the photo, now accompanied by a headline. "Poor Waitress gives jacket to freezing biker, a lesson in true kindness." "Look at all these comments." Lydia scrolled through what seemed like endless responses. "People are so touched by what you did. Some are asking how they can help you buy a new coat." Grace's embarrassment deepened. "I don't need help," she insisted, turning away to wipe down the already clean counter. "I just did what anyone would do." But it seemed the whole town had other ideas. As the morning progressed, more and more customers filtered in, many of them faces Grace had never seen before. They all wanted to meet the Angel Waitress. Some tried to press money into her hands, which she firmly refused. Others just wanted to shake her hand or give her a hug. "You remind me of my mother," one elderly gentleman said, his eyes misty. "She would have done the same thing." Grace handled it all with quiet grace, deflecting praise and continuing to serve coffee with warm smiles. But inside, she felt overwhelmed by the attention. This wasn't what she'd wanted when she'd given Hawk her coat. She'd just seen someone in need and responded the way her heart told her to. Meanwhile, miles away, Hawk sat in a cheap motel room, staring at his phone in disbelief. The article had popped up on his news feed, and seeing that photo hit him like a punch to the gut. In the harsh light of day, he could see clearly what he'd been too cold and proud to fully appreciate the night before. The kindness in her eyes, the way she'd shivered as she handed over her coat, the gentle strength in her voice when she'd refused to let him freeze. Guilt gnawed at his insides. He'd taken her coat and ridden away without a second thought, leaving her to walk home in the bitter cold. The article mentioned she was a widow, working late shifts to make ends meet. And still, she'd given her coat to a stranger. To him, a rough-looking biker who most people crossed the street to avoid. Hawk ran his hand over his face, feeling the scratch of his beard. The coat lay across the room's single chair, still carrying a faint scent of coffee and something gentle, maybe fabric softener. He stood up and picked it up, really looking at it for the first time. It was well worn, but carefully maintained, with neat stitching where small tears had been repaired. Someone had embroidered a tiny flower on the inside collar, the kind of personal touch that spoke of a garment being more than just clothing. He made his decision then. He couldn't keep this coat, not just because of the guilt, but because something about that simple act of kindness had cracked open something inside him he'd thought long dead. He needed to return it, needed to properly thank the woman who'd seen past his rough exterior to recognize a person in need. Back at the diner, Grace's phone continued to buzz in her apron pocket. She'd gotten better at politely declining interviews, telling reporters she was just doing what anyone should do. But the stream of customers continued, many taking selfies with her despite her protests. "You should be proud," Lydia insisted, having stationed herself at the counter for most of the morning. "People need stories like this. It reminds them there's still good in the world." Grace just shook her head, refilling coffee cups and taking orders. "I'm no angel," she said softly. "I just couldn't let him freeze." The day seemed to stretch on forever. By the time her evening shift rolled around, Grace was exhausted. Her feet ached, and her smile felt stretched thin. She kept thinking about Hawk, hoping he'd made it somewhere safe and warm. The forecast showed another cold night ahead, and she found herself saying little prayers for all the travelers out on the road. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Hawk was already on his way back to Maple Creek. His motorcycle roared down the highway, eating up the miles between them. This time, he wore her coat over his leather jacket, understanding now what a precious gift it had been. Not just the warmth, but the simple human kindness it represented. The sun was setting over Maple Creek, casting long shadows across the diner's parking lot. Grace moved between tables, coffee pot in hand, unaware that her simple act of compassion was about to come full circle. She couldn't have known that the man she'd helped was drawing closer with every passing minute, or that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. All she knew was that she was tired, that her feet hurt, and that somehow, despite all the chaos and attention of the day, she still didn't regret giving away her coat. Tommy would have understood. Some things, she thought, were worth more than staying warm. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun glinting off patches of snow still clinging to the ground. Grace had just finished setting up for the breakfast rush when she heard it, a low rumble in the distance, like approaching thunder. The sound grew louder, and soon the whole diner was vibrating with it. Betty, the morning cook, pressed her face against the window. "Good Lord above," she whispered. "Would you look at that?" Grace joined her at the window, and her coffee pot nearly slipped from her fingers. Motorcycles were pouring into the parking lot. Not just a few, but dozens, then hundreds. They came in waves, their chrome gleaming in the morning light. The riders wore leather jackets decorated with patches and club insignias, their bikes forming perfect lines as they filled every available space. The few regular customers inside the diner stood up, some backing away from the windows nervously. But there was something orderly, almost ceremonial, about the way the bikers arranged themselves. They created a massive circle around the diner, their engines rumbling in unison. "Grace," Betty touched her arm. "I think they're here for you." Heart pounding, Grace set down her coffee pot and walked to the door. As she stepped outside, the morning air still sharp with cold, more than 1,000 bikers sat astride their machines, forming a ring of chrome and leather that stretched as far as she could see. The sound was incredible, 1,000 engines idling at once, like the heartbeat of some massive mechanical beast. Then, through a gap in the circle, a familiar figure appeared. Hawk walked forward, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. He looked different, cleaned up, his beard trimmed, wearing fresh clothes. But what made her eyes well up was the sight of her old jacket, still draped over his leather vest. The engines fell silent one by one, until only the sound of boots on pavement could be heard. Hawk approached Grace, and to her surprise, he lowered himself slightly, almost kneeling. In his hands was a beautiful new leather jacket, black as midnight and butter soft. Embroidered across the back in elegant script was a single word: Grace. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And so does this." He shrugged off her old coat, handling it with unexpected gentleness. Grace reached out with trembling fingers to touch the new jacket. "I don't understand," she whispered. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, tall, with silver streaks in her dark hair and patches marking her as an officer in one of the clubs. "When we heard what you did," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet lot, "it touched something in all of us. One picture, one simple act of kindness. It spread through every motorcycle club in the country like wildfire." The woman smiled, her eyes bright. "We raised $50,000 in less than 24 hours. Every club, every chapter wanted to be part of this, because you reminded us, reminded everyone, What happens when one person still believes in good? Grace's vision blurred with tears. She looked around at the sea of faces. Some weathered and tough, others young and eager, all watching her with something like reverence. These were people society often feared or dismissed, yet here they were, gathered to honor a simple act of kindness. The crowd erupted in cheers as Hawk helped her into the new jacket. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. Someone started their engine, and like a wave, the sound built again, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. Word spread quickly through the small town, and soon the streets around the diner were packed with onlookers. The bikers began sharing stories, setting up grills in the parking lot, turning what had started as a ceremony into an impromptu celebration. As the day wore on, the entire town seemed to join in. Local musicians brought their instruments, setting up an informal stage in the back of a pickup truck. The smell of barbecue filled the air, and children darted between the parked motorcycles while their parents shared food and conversation with the leather-clad visitors. Grace moved through it all in a daze, accepting hugs and handshakes, hearing story after story of how her photo had touched people's lives. Some spoke of lost faith restored, others of being inspired to perform their own acts of kindness. Her cheeks hurt from smiling, and her heart felt so full it might burst. As evening approached, strings of lights appeared, strung between bikes and trees. The music shifted to slower songs, and couples began dancing in the parking lot. Grace stood at the edge of it all, watching her small town transformed into something magical. "You've caused quite a stir," a cold voice said behind her. Grace turned to find Mr. Crawley, the diner's owner, standing there. His face was set in its usual stern lines, but something else lurked in his expression, something that made her stomach clench. "Could I have a word?" he asked, gesturing toward the diner's side door. Grace followed him, the sounds of celebration fading slightly as they stepped away from the crowd. In the shadows beside the building, Crawley turned to face her. "I've made a decision," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "I'm selling the diner." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "Selling?" she repeated. "To whom?" "Interstate Food Services," he said. "They're planning to turn it into one of their franchise locations. The paperwork's already drawn up." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The diner wasn't just her workplace. It was her home away from home, the place where she'd worked alongside Tommy until his death, where she'd raised Ellie, where she'd found purpose in her loneliness. But what about... She gestured weakly towards the celebration, the lights, the people. "Business is business," Crawley said flatly. "All this attention is nice, but it doesn't change the bottom line." He turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone in the shadows. Behind her, the music played on, laughter and conversation floating through the evening air. But now it all seemed distant, unreal. The new jacket felt heavy on her shoulders as she realized that her livelihood and the heart of their small town might soon disappear forever. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the soft leather of her new jacket, hearing the joy of the celebration behind her. Somehow, in the space of a single day, she had experienced both a miracle and a heartbreak. The contrast was almost too much to bear. Grace woke before dawn, her mind already churning with determination, despite the previous night's devastating news. The morning light filtered through her bedroom curtains as she sat at her small kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, making calculations on the back of an envelope. The biker's generous donation of $50,000 sat in her account, a sum that still felt unreal. She'd planned to use it for repairs on her own house, maybe help Ellie with her student loans. But now it might save something even more precious. She dressed carefully in her best blouse and pressed slacks, items she usually saved for Sunday church. Looking in the mirror, she straightened her shoulders. "Tommy always said nothing's impossible with enough faith," she whispered to her reflection. The walk to Mr. Crawley's office felt longer than usual. The morning air was crisp, and frost still clung to the grass along Main Street. When she arrived, his secretary tried to wave her away, but Grace stood firm. "I need to see him," she insisted. "It's about the diner." Crawley looked up from his desk with obvious irritation when she entered. "Mrs. Malone, I'm quite busy." "I want to buy the diner," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have $50,000 for a down payment." Crawley's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "The Interstate Food Services deal is worth $500,000, Grace. Your offer isn't even worth considering." He turned back to his paperwork. "Besides, the contracts are already drawn up." "But it hasn't been signed yet, has it?" Grace pressed. "It will be, next Friday." He didn't even look up. "Now, if you'll excuse me..." Grace left his office, but instead of feeling defeated, she felt a familiar fire in her chest, the same determination that had gotten her through Tommy's death, through raising Ellie alone, through countless hard winters. At the diner, she found Hawk sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. He'd stayed behind when the other bikers left, claiming his bike needed repairs. But she'd seen him watching her, noticed how his eyes followed her movements with quiet concern. "The sign's falling apart," he said by way of greeting. "I could fix it. Used to do electrical work in the service." Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You were in the Army?" Hawk nodded, his fingers tapping an unconscious rhythm on his mug. "Medic, 2 tours." His voice grew distant. "Saw things, did things." He trailed off, and Grace noticed how his hands trembled slightly. "Sometimes the hardest wounds to heal are the ones nobody can see," she said softly. His eyes met hers, recognition flickering in their depths. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, understanding passing between them without words. "We could start a petition," he said suddenly. "Get the town involved. This place means something to people." By noon, Grace had set up a folding table outside the diner with a petition sheet. She'd called the local newspaper, and a young reporter named Jenny arrived with a camera, eager to cover the story of the angel waitress fighting to save her diner. Word spread quickly through Maple Creek's social networks, church groups, the PTA, the Veterans Association. People began dropping by, signing the petition, sharing stories about first dates and family celebrations held in the highway diner's worn booths. Hawk, true to his word, spent the afternoon working on the sign. The sight of him up on a ladder, tools spread out around him, drew curious onlookers. Other volunteers began appearing. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop brought cleaning supplies, Bob from the hardware store donated paint, and the high school football team showed up after practice to help move furniture. The diner transformed day by day. Faded walls brightened with fresh paint, torn booth cushions were reupholstered, and the chrome fixtures gleamed again. Even the parking lot improved as Hawk and some local mechanics filled in potholes and repainted lines. During breaks, Grace and Hawk would share coffee and quiet conversations. She learned he'd been drifting since leaving the Army, unable to settle anywhere, haunted by memories he couldn't put into words. But she saw how his shoulders relaxed when he worked with his hands, how his eyes brightened when townspeople thanked him for his help. "Why are you staying?" she asked him one afternoon, watching him repair a wobbly table. He was quiet for a long moment, focused on his work. "Because," he finally said, "sometimes you find a place that feels like it could be home." The local news ran a story about their efforts, featuring interviews with longtime customers and shots of the community coming together. Small donations began trickling in, $5 here, 20 there, mostly accompanied by notes sharing memories of the diner. But time was running out. Crawley had set the closing date for 2 weeks away, and despite their efforts, they were nowhere near the amount needed to match Interstate Food Service's offer. Grace tried not to let her worry show, but late at night, after everyone had gone home, she would sit in her favorite booth and pray for a miracle. One evening, as she was closing up, she found Hawk still there, nursing a cold cup of coffee. "What if we can't save it?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Hawk stood and walked to the window, looking out at the newly painted parking lot where the morning sun would soon welcome another day of hope and struggle. "Then we'll know we tried," he said simply. "That we didn't just let it die without a fight." Grace joined him at the window, their reflections pale against the darkness outside. The diner's neon sign, now fixed and glowing steadily, cast a warm light over them both. 2 weeks didn't seem like much time to save a dream, but as she stood there with Hawk, watching the stars appear over Maple Creek, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the quiet certainty that she wasn't alone in this fight. "Tomorrow's another day," she said softly, and Hawk nodded, understanding in his eyes. They had 14 days left to save the highway diner, and every minute would count. The last fundraiser guest waved goodbye as Grace began stacking chairs. Her muscles ached, but pride warmed her chest. They'd raised $342 tonight. Not enough to save the diner, but enough to keep hope alive. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily under the streetlights. Grace's breath formed little clouds as she locked the diner's front door, her fingers stiff with cold. The metal key felt icy against her skin. "Let me walk you home." She turned to find Hawk emerging from the shadows, his leather jacket gleaming with melted snow. He'd stayed late again, helping clean up after the fundraiser, though he hardly spoke a word all evening. "Thank you," Grace said softly. "It's a beautiful night for a walk." They fell into step together, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. The streets of Maple Creek were silent except for the distant whistle of a freight train and the gentle tinkling of icicles in the breeze. "Tommy loved nights like this," Grace found herself saying. "He'd make hot chocolate and we'd sit on the porch watching the snow fall." She hadn't spoken of her late husband in months, but something about the quiet night and Hawk's steady presence made the memories feel less painful. Hawk nodded, his face thoughtful in the dim light. "Lost my best friend in Afghanistan," he said after a while. "Jimmy. Used to love the snow, too. Said it reminded him of home in Minnesota." They walked another block in understanding silence. Grace noticed how Hawk's shoulders seemed less tense than usual, as if sharing that small piece of his past had lightened some invisible burden. "After Tommy died," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I threw myself into work. Double shifts, extra hours, anything to keep busy. Figured if I worked hard enough it wouldn't hurt so much." "Yeah," Hawk's voice was rough. "Did the same thing after Jimmy. Took every dangerous assignment they'd give me. Then more tours. Kept moving so the memories couldn't catch up." They passed the town square, where Christmas lights still twinkled in the trees. Grace remembered hanging those lights with Tommy years ago, how he'd lifted her up to reach the highest branches, both of them laughing like teenagers. "Sometimes I feel guilty," she admitted, "for laughing, for having good days, like I'm somehow being disloyal to his memory." Hawk stopped walking, turning to face her. His eyes were intense in the soft glow of the street lamp. "Your husband, Tommy, he loved you?" Grace nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. "Then he'd want you to laugh," Hawk said firmly. "To have good days. To live." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, but they weren't entirely sad tears. Something in Hawk's words felt like permission to heal, to hope, to move forward without leaving love behind. They resumed walking, the snow cushioning their steps. Grace noticed how Hawk automatically shortened his stride to match hers, how he positioned himself between her and the street. Small gestures of protection that seemed as natural to him as breathing. Her small house came into view, its porch light casting a warm glow on the fresh snow. They climbed the steps together, and Grace fumbled for her house keys. Hawk cleared his throat. "Grace," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. "That night, when you gave me your jacket." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I didn't just need warmth. I needed a reason to believe again. In people, in kindness, in myself, maybe." Grace turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. This tough, quiet man who'd spent years running from his past was finally standing still, speaking his truth. "You gave me that," he continued softly. "A reason to believe." Grace smiled through the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "You gave me something too," she whispered. "You reminded me that miracles still happen, that good people still exist." Hawk nodded once, his eyes bright with emotion. Then he turned and walked away into the night, his figure gradually disappearing into the falling snow. But this time, Grace knew with certainty that he would return. She wiped her eyes and unlocked her front door, stepping into the familiar darkness of her home. As she reached for the light switch, her foot caught on something, an envelope that had been slipped under her door. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a check from the National Veterans Motorcycle Alliance, made out to Save the Highway Diner Fund for $20,000. A note was attached. "Dear Grace, your kindness to one of our brothers has touched hearts across the country. We stand with you. Ride free. The end may." Grace sank into her favorite armchair, holding the check like it might disappear if she blinked. $20,000. From people she'd never met, would never know. All because she'd given a cold stranger her jacket on a snowy night. Tears fell freely now, but they were tears of gratitude and determination. Tomorrow she would deposit this check and add it to their growing fund. She would keep fighting for the diner, for the community it served, for the home it had become to so many. Because now she knew she wasn't fighting alone. Somewhere out there, countless people were standing with her, believing in the power of one small act of kindness to change the world. Grace clutched the check to her chest and whispered a prayer of thanks into the quiet night. Then she stood up, straightened her shoulders, and began planning tomorrow's battle to save the highway diner. Grace's hands trembled as she stood in Mr. Crawley's office, clutching the envelope containing her final offer. The morning sun streamed through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across his desk. $20,000 from the bikers, plus the earlier $50,000, and her life savings. It was everything she had. "Mr. Crawley," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I have a new offer for the diner." Crawley looked up from his paperwork, his expression guarded. "Grace, we've been through this. The corporate deal." "The whole town is watching," she interrupted gently. "They've seen what this place means to people, what it could be again." She laid out the numbers, explaining how the community had rallied together. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, regular customers, townspeople, and several bikers who'd stayed behind to help. Their presence felt like a silent vote of support. Crawley stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he just stared at the crowd. Then, surprisingly, his shoulders slumped. "You know," he said, quietly, "Martha, my wife, she loved that diner. Said it was the heart of Maple Creek." He turned back to Grace. "I've been so angry since losing her, I forgot that." Grace waited, hardly daring to breathe. 125,000, he said finally. "That's half what the chain offered. But it's yours, if you want it." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The news spread through town like wildfire. By afternoon, the diner's parking lot had become an impromptu celebration. Someone brought out an old radio, and music filled the air. Children drew chalk pictures on the pavement while their parents shared stories about first dates and late-night coffee runs at the highway diner. Hawk stood beside Grace, watching the scene with a slight smile. "What are you going to call it?" "Grace's Place," she answered without hesitation. A reminder that grace, both the divine kind and the human kind, can change everything. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Hawk organized teams of bikers to help with repairs, fixing loose floorboards, patching the roof, and replacing cracked windows. Local families began bringing in pieces of themselves to share. Old photographs of the town, handwritten recipe cards yellowed with age, even furniture that held special memories. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery brought in her grandmother's pie cabinet, its glass still pristine after 60 years. "For displaying those famous pies of yours," she said with a wink. Mr. Chen from the hardware store donated a beautiful old mirror that had hung in his father's restaurant. "For good luck," he explained. Grace's former co-workers, Sarah, Mike, and elderly Betty, all came back when she called. "Wouldn't work anywhere else," Betty declared, straightening her apron. "This place is home." The week before Christmas Eve became a symphony of hammers, paintbrushes, and laughter. Children helped string popcorn garlands while their parents hung wreaths and ribbons. The old booths were reupholstered in warm red vinyl, and local artists painted winter scenes on the windows. Hawk worked tirelessly, seemingly everywhere at once. He fixed the ancient coffee machine, installed new light fixtures, and spent hours on a ladder hanging fairy lights along the roof and around every window. Grace caught him grinning as he worked, looking younger somehow, more at peace. "You've turned this truck stop into a miracle," he called down to her one afternoon, carefully stringing another strand of lights. "Who'd have thought?" "God works in mysterious ways," Grace replied, handing him more lights, sometimes through bikers and waitresses. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a tired, fading diner became something magical. Old photographs lined the walls, wedding receptions, high school graduations, family reunions, all celebrated within these walls over the decades. Recipe cards were framed and hung proudly in the kitchen, each one telling its own story of shared meals and love passed down through generations. The night before the grand reopening, Grace stood in the empty diner, taking it all in. Christmas lights twinkled everywhere, reflecting off the freshly polished chrome. The old ceiling fans gleamed, and the checkerboard floor shone like new. But it wasn't just the physical changes that moved her. It was the feeling of the place. Every corner held pieces of people's lives, freely given to make this space their own again. Hawk appeared beside her, quiet as always. "Beautiful," he said simply. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She walked to the window, looking out at her diner, her miracle, glowing like a beacon in the winter night. The fairy lights created a warm halo around the building, and the new sign, hand-painted by local artists, proclaimed Grace's Place in elegant script. For the first time in years, she felt her faith surge strong and clear within her heart. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude for this gift. Not just the diner, but the reminder that love could still work miracles, that community could still heal hearts, that grace could still change everything. "Thank you," she breathed, the words meant for both heaven and earth. "Thank you for believing." The Christmas Eve celebration would begin tomorrow, but tonight, in this quiet moment, Grace knew she was already home. Her diner would continue to be what it had always been meant to be, a place of warmth, welcome, and grace for all who entered its doors. Christmas Eve dawned bright and cold in Maple Creek. Grace arrived at the diner before sunrise, her breath visible in the frosty air as she unlocked the front door. Inside, everything sparkled, tinsel catching the first rays of morning light, ornaments gleaming on a small tree in the corner, and fairy lights twinkling everywhere. She moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, starting the coffee and warming the ovens. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air as she began baking her special Christmas pies, apple, pecan, and her famous cherry that everyone loved. By mid-morning, people started arriving. Veterans in pressed uniforms came first, helping to set up extra chairs and tables. Bikers rolled in on their motorcycles, their leather jackets adorned with holiday pins. Families arrived carrying dishes for the potluck, casseroles, cookies, and homemade breads. Children gathered around the old jukebox, feeding at quarters and singing along to Christmas carols. Silent night mixed with their laughter, creating a soundtrack of pure joy. Some of the younger ones had made paper chains and snowflakes, which they proudly hung wherever they could reach. "Miss Grace," little Sarah Thompson called out, her red dress twirling as she danced. "Can we put more decorations up there?" She pointed to an empty spot near the ceiling. Grace smiled, watching as one of the bikers, a gentle giant named Bear, lifted Sarah onto his shoulders so she could hang her paper creations. The sight made her heart swell. The afternoon flowed into evening, and still more people came. The diner was filled to bursting with warmth and laughter. Old Mr. Jenkins, who rarely left his house anymore, sat in a corner booth telling war stories to a group of young veterans. Mrs. Chen taught a group of bikers how to fold paper cranes for good luck, their tattooed hands carefully creasing the delicate paper. Near the counter, Hawk stood watching it all, something soft in his usually guarded expression. He caught Grace's eye and motioned her over, holding a small wrapped box. "Got something for you," he said quietly, placing it in her hands. Grace carefully unwrapped the package, gasping when she saw what was inside. It was her old coat, the one she'd given him that snowy night that felt so long ago now. But it wasn't the same anymore. Someone had carefully mended every worn spot, reinforced every seam. On the back, beautiful embroidery spelled out the words, "Never stop giving," in elegant script. "The ladies in our club did the needlework," Hawk explained, his voice rough with emotion. "They wanted you to have it back, but better. Like what you did for all of us. Made us better." Grace pressed the coat to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. Without words, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. He returned the embrace, and for a moment they stood there, acknowledging everything that had changed since that cold night. The evening continued, filled with stories and songs. Tommy Chen played his guitar while people sang carols. Children dozed in their parents' laps, sticky with candy canes and hot chocolate. The old diner had never felt more alive. As midnight approached, people began gathering their things, heading home through the gentle snowfall. Grace and Hawk moved through the diner, cleaning up plates and cups, sharing comfortable silence. That's when Grace smelled it, just a hint of something burning. She turned toward the window and saw orange light flickering against the curtains. A forgotten candle had toppled over, and flames were already climbing up the fabric. "Fire!" she shouted, dropping the plates she was holding. "Everyone out!" Hawk was already moving, guiding the remaining customers toward the door. Grace grabbed the fire extinguisher, but the flames had spread too quickly, eating up the dry curtains and reaching for the ceiling. "Grace, leave it," Hawk called, pulling her away from the spreading fire. "We need to get out." They made sure everyone was safely outside, counting heads in the parking lot as smoke began pouring from the windows. Someone had called 911, and sirens wailed in the distance. Grace could only watch, clutching Hawk's hand tightly as flames consumed the back section of her beloved diner. The fire department arrived quickly, but even their swift response couldn't prevent significant damage. Water arced through the night air, steam rising where it met the flames. The smell of smoke filled everything, bitter and sharp against the sweet Christmas air. Around her, the community that had just celebrated new beginnings now stood in shocked silence. Children cried softly into their mothers' coats. Bikers removed their caps in respect. Veterans stood at attention, as if honoring a fallen comrade. The flames gradually died under the firefighters' assault, leaving behind blackened walls and shattered windows. Part of the roof had collapsed, and water ran in dark rivers across the parking lot. The Christmas lights, somehow still burning on the undamaged front of the building, cast a surreal glow over the scene. Grace stood in the gently falling snow, her restored coat pulled tight around her shoulders, watching everything she'd built turn to ashes. Hawk's hand remained steady in hers, anchoring her as her world burned. The community that had risen so recently from despair now faced ruin again. Their Christmas celebration turned to cinders in the cold December air. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy over Maple Creek, a bitter reminder of how quickly joy could turn to sorrow. The diner, their sanctuary of second chances, stood partially destroyed against the dark sky, its windows black and empty, where warmth and light had filled them just hours before. Dawn broke over Maple Creek with a gray, listless light. The morning after the fire brought no comfort, only a stark revelation of destruction in the harsh winter daylight. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the cloudy sky like metal flowers. Cameras rolled as reporters gestured at the blackened shell of Grace's place, their voices carrying phrases like "Christmas tragedy" and "local landmark destroyed." Grace sat alone on the cold curb, her restored jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. Soot streaked her tired face, and her eyes held a hollow look that spoke of more than physical exhaustion. She watched silently as firefighters conducted their final inspection, their heavy boots crunching through frozen puddles and charred debris. "Thank you, Lord, that no one was hurt," she whispered, her breath visible in the winter air. But the prayer felt mechanical, automatic, like the countless times she'd refilled coffee cups without thinking. Inside, something felt broken, as if the flames had consumed more than just wood and plaster. The insurance adjuster came by mid-morning, his clipboard and careful words bringing little comfort. "The policy will cover some of the damage," he explained, "but given the age of the building and the extent of the destruction..." His voice trailed off as he flipped through papers, avoiding her eyes. The message was clear. The coverage would barely touch what was needed for repairs. Hawk stood at the edge of the parking lot, his broad shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. The guilt radiated from him in almost visible waves. He'd been the last one checking the Christmas decorations, making sure everything was perfect for Grace. The candle, that single forgotten candle, weighed on his conscience like a stone. "It wasn't your fault," Grace told him, her voice gentle despite her own pain. "It was an accident, just an accident." But she could see her words weren't reaching him. The old shadows had returned to his eyes, the same darkness she'd seen that first night by the gas pumps. Later that afternoon, when Grace went to find him again, Hawk was gone. His motorcycle no longer stood in its usual spot. No note, no goodbye, just tire tracks in the snow already filling with fresh flakes. The disappearance hit her like a physical blow, stealing what little strength she had left. Days passed in a blur of gray skies and white snow. The burnt remains of Grace's place stood like a wound in the center of town, gradually being covered by winter's quiet blanket. The news crews packed up their equipment and moved on to other stories. The viral posts about the angel waitress were buried under newer, more exciting content. Donations, which had flowed so freely before, dried up completely. People still stopped her on the street, offering sad smiles and awkward condolences, but their lives moved forward. The town found other places to gather, other stories to tell. The miracle that had brought them together seemed to evaporate like steam in the winter air. Grace retreated to her small house, drawing the curtains against well-meaning visitors. She spent hours sitting in her rocking chair, Tommy's old flannel shirt draped across her lap, whispering prayers that seemed to bounce off the ceiling and fall back, unanswered, at her feet. Was it all for nothing? She asked the empty room one evening, watching snow fall outside her window. Does kindness only last for a season? Her fingers traced the embroidered words on her jacket. Never stop giving. But now they felt more like mockery than inspiration. The silence of her house pressed in around her, broken only by the tick of the old clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, Maple Creek continued its winter routine. The streets quiet except for the scrape of snow shovels and the distant hum of traffic on the highway, where truckers now passed through without stopping. A week crawled by, each day heavier than the last. Grace sat at her kitchen window, watching snowflakes drift down like ashes of her dreams. Then she heard it, a low rumble in the distance. Strange, she murmured, setting down her coffee cup. No storms in the forecast. But the rumble grew louder, more mechanical than natural. Her heart skipped when she recognized the sound. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. No. Hundreds. Grace hurried to her front porch, wrapping her arms against the cold. Her jaw dropped at the sight before her. Thousands of bikers poured into Maple Creek from every direction, their engines creating a thunderous symphony. They came down Highway 47, filled side streets, and spilled into empty lots. Leading them all was Hawk, his familiar silhouette unmistakable at the front of the pack. His face showed fierce determination as he guided the massive group toward what remained of the diner. Breaking news from Maple Creek! A local reporter's voice caught Grace's attention. Television crews were setting up, broadcasting live. In an unprecedented show of support, motorcycle clubs from across America have gathered for what they're calling the Ride for Grace. Behind the first wave of bikers came trucks, big rigs loaded with construction materials, lumber, tiles, drywall, and more. Grace could barely process what she was seeing. Hawk parked his bike and strode toward her, his eyes bright with purpose. Been busy, he said simply. Grace's legs trembled as she stepped forward. You did all this? We all did. Every club from here to California. People heard what happened and wanted to help. The miracle wasn't over, Grace, it was just getting started. The crowd began chanting, Grace, Grace, Grace! She broke down then, tears flowing freely as she hugged Hawk tight. In that moment she understood. The true miracle hadn't been the jacket she gave away, or even the money raised. It was this. How love could multiply, how kindness could echo across a continent, bringing strangers together in ways she never imagined possible. The transformation of Grace's place began at dawn the next day. The sound of hammers and saws filled the crisp morning air as volunteers swarmed the site like busy bees. Local teenagers, armed with paintbrushes and boundless energy, covered the new walls in warm, welcoming colors. Veterans, their faces focused with purpose, meticulously laid tiles in perfect rows, while bikers set up makeshift kitchens to feed the growing army of helpers. "Here, try this chili," a burly biker called out, stirring a massive pot. "My grandma's secret recipe." Grace moved through it all, her eyes bright with renewed purpose. Every few hours, she and Hawk would take short breaks, sitting on overturned buckets with steaming cups of coffee. "You know," Hawk said softly during one such moment, "sometimes the best kind of faith isn't the kind you hold on to. It's the kind that holds on to you." Grace nodded, understanding perfectly. She watched as former strangers worked side by side, passing tools and sharing laughs. The town that had once seemed so fractured now moved in perfect harmony, like a well-oiled machine. After 3 weeks of non-stop work, the new diner stood complete. It was bigger than before, with large windows that let in streams of natural light. The chrome fixtures gleamed, and the booths were deep and comfortable. Above the entrance, they hung the new sign that made Grace's heart swell. Grace's Place, where kindness gathers. As evening approached, someone flipped a switch. The new neon sign hummed to life, casting a warm, inviting glow across the fresh snow. The red and blue lights seemed to dance against the white ground, creating a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. The grand reopening of Grace's Place drew hundreds of visitors from across the country. Cars and motorcycles filled every space in the freshly paved parking lot, spilling onto the highway shoulder. Grace stood at the entrance, her eyes bright with joy as she welcomed each person who came through the doors. "Jimmy from Oklahoma," she called out, hugging a leather-clad biker. "And Sarah with her little ones. Look how they've grown." She knew some by name, others just by the warmth in their hearts, but she embraced them all the same. Hawk stood proudly beside her, his weathered face softened by a gentle smile. The man who once couldn't accept a simple jacket now watched with wonder as strangers became family under Grace's care. Inside, the diner hummed with life. Children pressed their faces against the gleaming display case, while veterans shared stories over steaming cups of coffee. On one wall, a collection of framed photographs told their story. The viral photo of Grace giving away her coat, the first circle of 1,000 bikers, and snapshots of the community rebuilding together. Local news crews captured the moment as Grace cut the red ribbon stretched across the entrance. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke into the microphones. "I dedicate this place to everyone who ever believed kindness still mattered." As evening settled in and the crowds thinned, Grace and Hawk found themselves in the corner booth by the window, their fingers intertwined as they watched snowflakes dance under the streetlight. In the distance, a few motorcycles rumbled softly, a gentle reminder of how their story began. Above them, mounted on the wall, a wooden plaque caught the warm diner light. Its engraved words read, "One act of kindness can thaw 1,000 hearts." Grace smiled, surrounded by the sound of laughter and clinking coffee cups, her faith in miracles restored, and her heart overflowing with gratitude. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.